Hello, welcome to the Contracts Prof blog vlog, which we've called Contract Stuff. Um, Dan Barnheiser from Michigan State and I, Jeremy Tellman from Oklahoma City, are the constants in this venue. Today we have a special guest, Professor Rachel Arno-Richmond from the University of Florida, who is at least my go-to person for employment law questions. And Dan has some videos that we're going to share with you that foreground employment law issues, and we thought Rachel was the perfect person to bring on board for this session. And since it's Dan's idea, I'm now going to hand it over to him. It's your show.
All right. Well, this is a series of videos I ran across when I was procrastinating writing exams a little while ago, as many of us are wont to do. And I like them. It involves a recurring character, Veronica, who kind of embodies sort of the ultimate employee fantasy of how we'd sometimes like to deal with our employers, with our coworkers, but we realize it's probably a really bad idea. But at any rate, we've got this short, how Veronica handles an unfair overtime policy. And in this, Veronica's on light time, which we've assumed means she's only working only contracted to work a certain number of hours per week, and the employer calls her in to work outside of those hours. So we'll start real quick and start commenting after that.
Hi, Janet. What's up?
Hey, Veronica, I know you're on light duty and I know it's a Sunday, but I'll pay you overtime. We really need some extra hands on this scene right now.
Yeah, I'll do it for some overtime. Just send me the address and I'll be on my way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, so right there, my thoughts, that kind of looks like a contract. Rachel, what do you, in the employment relationship, how would you characterize it?
Well, so I think we've got to back up because if they are in an employment relationship, which it seems like they are, they're already in a contract. So that contract looks something like she has an hourly rate, she has a finite number of hours that she's committed to doing. I think that's probably what the video means when they say light duty. It's not necessarily how we would use the term in employment law or in the HR context specifically, but we can surmise that they have a standing agreement about that. She's clearly being asked to do more. And I think, it's reasonable to see that as its own independent exchange. Another way to look at it is that because of the nature of the employment relationship, how fluid it is and often long-term, there's a lot that goes unsaid, and we generally assume that employers have some discretion to, impose other terms or to make additional requests. It's pretty clear that this supervisor knows that she's outside the norm and is offering something maybe that she doesn't have authority to offer herself. But certainly from Veronica's perspective, and you can see by the way she sort of jumps on the opportunity, if there's overtime, she will be there.
It's pay more for the same work. Jeremy, when we were talking about this video series, you had mentioned relational contracting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so but I do want to say something about that, but first it also occurs to me that the conversation clearly arises within a contractual context, right? They're using terms like light duties that they clearly understand, and both Veronica and her boss seem to have an implicit understanding what it means to work overtime. I think that's usually time and a half, right? So there's a contractual context here. Doesn't need to be a written contract. It could just be implied through conduct. And then ultimately, for Veronica's sake, I'm really curious to know whether she has a term contract or is at will, because that could be relevant too. But so I think the tension in these videos that Dan has identified is that Veronica is like the id of the employee. She says the things that we all. Actually, I'm not like this. I love my job. I'm always surprised that anybody pays me to do what I do. So if I had an office job, I guess that would be my attitude. And she says the things that we'd all like to say. But because contracts are relational, the worker that an employer values is the worker who gets the job done and doesn't make waves. And that's not Veronica. And that's why we all have to repress our id and see therapists on the weekend.
I love that. All right, let's.
Hi, Janet. What's up?
I'll stop this.
Hey, Veronica, I know you're on light duty and I know it's a Sunday, but I'll pay you overtime. We really need some extra hands on this scene right now.
Yeah, I'll do it for some overtime. Just send me the address and I'll be on my way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, so we'll pick up there with the after the technical glitch I just had. But right now, Veronica's worked her overtime. She's gone in on a Sunday. She's done extra work. And then 3 days later, this happens.
Hey, Veronica, do you have a quick second?
Yeah, what's up?
So it turns out that when you are on light duty, you cannot get paid overtime. So.
And what does that have to do with me?
It means that I can't pay you overtime for when you came in on Sunday to help us. So you can take tomorrow off or you can leave early a couple days this week. I'm just not going to be able to pay you that overtime.
All right. Rachel, you had an absolutely visceral reaction to this part of the segment.
Well, you can look at it through the lens of employment law, or you can look at it through the lens of contract law, and I think that the contract frame is probably what is sort of interesting here. But it's important to recognize that there are wage theft laws. There's a whole statutory scheme. Employer cannot do this. There is, once there's an agreement about the wages that are being paid and the employee pays them, they have to be paid, and there are state and federal laws that demand that, involve liquidated damages and so on. And so, you could put this in that frame. I guess, from the, employer's perspective, there might be some questions about whether Veronica has agreed by virtue of accepting the job to whatever the company policies are with respect to pay.
Oh.
And so, those policies, genuinely a supervisor might not be able to deviate from them. And maybe there's an apparent authority question there. What I will say is that, in a situation where there is an employee and the relationship is set up with some basic parameters, the general understanding is that the worker's at will and the employer is permitted to make changes midway through. And so in an at-will system, employers have a lot of discretion, but for the most part, those are prospective decisions that can be changed. So, I certainly have a problem with this from both a contract and employment law perspective.
And I think your point on apparent authority was hugely important because, a normal employee is like, oh, well, my boss said it's okay, so it's okay. But when, for apparent authority, the reliance must be reasonable. And if I represent the employer, my first argument is going to be exactly what you said. Look, here you have access to our policies on our HR website. Should you clicked, I read them when you were first hired, and we've sent you copies every time we unilaterally change them, and you click I accept, and you continued working for us. So your supposed reliance on a supervisor acting contrary to those policies is unreasonable, which itself is as absurd as acceptance for boilerplate terms in a standard form contract that we click through on the internet.
Can I jump in and say more so, Dan?
Yeah.
Because in a nameless, faceless transaction online, we don't have any reason, this goes to the relational point, to expect that things might be different from the boilerplate that we choose not to read. Whereas in the employment context, given that you're interacting with people day in, day out, it's much more reasonable to expect a deviation from that standard boilerplate policy, in my opinion.
It's the abuse of trust by the employer, the bait and switch.
Absolutely.
So should we keep going and find out the justification that the employer is giving? Go ahead, Jeremy.
Just 2 cents. I was also thinking about the apparent authority issue, and the situation is interesting because, right, I mean, Veronica seems to know everything, but her boss doesn't, and her boss doesn't know anything about apparent authority, right? And so what her boss knows is that her boss's boss, she's going to be in trouble with her boss's boss if she pays Veronica overtime, and so she thinks that's the end of the conversation. Like, I said what I said, but it turns out I can't do that. So sorry, my hands are tied, right? But it turns out, right, Veronica's right. Untie your hands,
Yeah.
right? You've committed yourself. You had apparent authority to do so. I was entitled to rely on it. Sorry, you have to pay me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so what I was going to add to that is, and I always make this point with my employment law students, which is that the supervisor is also an employee. And we have to sort of realize that when we think about the hierarchy and relational hierarchy in employment. So she, probably the supervisor, feels just as sort of vulnerable and limited as Veronica feels vis-a-vis her boss. And so this is really a great situation for where there has to be a grown-up in the room, someone who does have the authority and does understand the law and does understand the company's obligations, and hopefully that's HR.
And you would also hope that there would be a grown-up somewhere who would say, "Oh, we were really short-staffed on Sunday, and we needed to have extra hands. It costs money to bring in extra hands. Your alternative is to go to a temporary agency where you're going to be paying double or triple the normal rates for getting the extra labor."
That's a great point, and I think it points up another challenge with the employment relationship because it's a closed world. And these individuals who are captive, as you were, are operating in an internal labor market. There's an expectation that all of the resources that the company needs can come from these folks, and the scale, the rates, the compensation are coming from that world. And it's just not the case, and that may be in part because, workers have limited bargaining power to leave, that they're not thinking about things like external labor rates and what it would cost on an open market to replace these services. Those workers are viewed, the rank and file certainly, as captive, and there's an expectation that the employer is going to get everything it needs from its existing workforce pursuant to its own policies, as opposed to making that calculation on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Well, let's try the next segment and see how it turns out.
Yeah, and no, I'm not doing that. The only reason I came in to help you guys on a Sunday was because I was going to get the overtime. With the holidays right around the corner, I could use the extra money. I'm not going home and flexing my time because you didn't know the policy, Janet. I'm so sorry. There's just no way for me to pay you.
So I'm not sure that one adds a lot, other than it deepens the relationship and it provides the excuse. From a negotiation standpoint, obviously this is an appeal to a higher authority. And I think that we were talking briefly before this about gendered approaches and to the negotiation relationship. A famous book by Babcock and LeShaver, Women Don't Ask, really brings out a lot of these issues for me in the workplace.
There is one sort of employment law dimension here that, and I certainly would be interested in talking more about the gender dynamics. Definitely have thoughts about that. But just by way of background, again, this is all seemed to be happening pursuant to this workplace's policies. And so when they use terms like light duty and overtime, that's just what they're talking about. They're not talking about legal mandates, legal terms of art. But it is the case that in the world of federal labor standards and in most state equivalents, it's very explicit that you cannot provide comp time in lieu of overtime or force an employee to do some, to work a different schedule in order to counteract or to make up for that overtime. And there's an exception in government for government employees, which is why they have comp time. But this was specifically the intent of those laws, kind of going back, it's 1930s Depression era legislation. And the fact was that, we wanted as a society for employees to have money in their pockets, not to have loose promises of time off, not to have company script, but actual dollars in a timely way for the work that they did. So this is an old problem, and one that the law has sought to address. Veronica's right once again.
Jeremy?
So earlier, Rachel talked about, the adults in the room are hopefully in the HR department. I don't have that much experience with this. I'm used to HR department just saying, sorry, the rules are the rules. Are you confident that the HR department in a situation like this would look up the federal and state regulations and say, well, we're just going to have to eat this one. Janet made a mistake. We'll tell her going forward not to do that again, but we have to pay Veronica.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should not say that I'm overly confident in HR. It varies a lot depending on the size and sophistication of the company. I think the answer to that is going to depend on whether we are in the world of relational contract or whether we are in the world of fair labor standards and regulations. So, any sophisticated or just reasonably competent employer is going to know a whole lot about the need to comply with overtime requirements if they're mandates. But on the other hand, in this individual situation, if we're just talking about company policy, Veronica's going to have to get pretty testy.
My guess would be a union is going to make the big difference.
Yeah, so, very few workers in the United States are unionized. We're down to about 13%, and most of those are public sector workers. So union density is very low, but if there is a union that is actually in a collective bargaining relationship and has a formal collective bargaining agreement, this kind of thing is going to be spelled out.
Mm-hmm.
And then 100%, there is not only a clear obligation on the part of the company, there's also an apparatus for redressing it, and that is the labor arbitration and grievance process. And so in that situation, a union representative is going to help Veronica file a claim to get the money that she needs. And you also will probably have people on the employer side who, maybe in HR or maybe, labor contract experts who are able to look at the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, and say, no, this is what you have to do.
And I think that that the union aspect raises another issue that appears throughout this series of videos where Veronica occupies a bunch of different jobs. There's this current video, we don't know who the employer is, but she has worked for airlines, she's worked for insurance companies, she's worked, I think, for a marketing firm. I don't know if there's a real person behind Veronica other than the face behind G Plus Animation. But the number of jobs, and a lot of them suggest that she's actually a gig worker, that she may be just an independent contractor, in which case the union protections that might be achieved from a unionized workplace are not going to be there or not be as strong for these purely temporary employees. I think much of the video keeps going, and I'll play a little bit more, but so people get a flavor. But we're going to put the address, web address for the video in the description, and but I'll play a little bit more, and then we can offer some final thoughts.
I don't know. I just need you to leave early this week, or like I said, take a whole day off. But there's just no way for me to pay you. You're going to have to figure out a way to pay me my overtime, even if I'm on light duty, because you called me and said, Veronica, I will pay you overtime to come out and help us today. So if that wasn't permitted, that's something that you as a manager needed to know before you called me. But no, I'm not flexing my time.
All right. And, I think that captures the kind of the desire to say, this is my right. We had a contract. You made a promise, and I relied on that promise. We can frame it however we want, but the sense here is that Veronica is, as Jeremy put it earlier, Veronica is our it. She feels like she's being wronged, and in my opinion, I think she is. So, any concluding thoughts?
Well, I would just go back to what you said before about sort of gender dynamics, because I think one question, I think we look at this like Jeremy said, it's the id. We don't necessarily expect that an employee would truly speak in this way, even though she does have this entitlement. But it may be that it's easier to imagine an employee speaking this way with a female boss as opposed to a male boss. So I think it's sort of just worth noting that it's not just the gender dynamics of women being less inclined to ask, but also maybe the gender dynamics of who they are willing to stand up to. That it's playing a role here as well. But I think this is an easy case for Veronica.
Awesome. Jeremy, it's over to you. Any final thoughts?
Um, Not so. I guess I have a personal anecdote. So I am not Veronica. So the first time I got offered a job, a teaching job, I asked if I could have 2 weeks to think about it, and the chair of the department, who was not in communication with the hiring committee, said, "Well, no. If you turn us down, we'll just go to the next person on the list." So I took the job, and it was fine. It was good. I mean, it was wonderful. It was my first teaching job. Then later, when I was a law professor, we hired somebody who came from Big Law, and uh, and he negotiated to have a starting salary. I don't know how I found this out. I guess he told me. He negotiated to have a starting salary higher than mine, even though I'd already been there for like 5, 7 years, whatever it was. And so clearly, like I'm misgendered here. I'm the person who doesn't ask, and it didn't take much for me to learn that lesson. But other people do it all the time, and it would just never occur to me.
Yeah, well, I think what that goes to is that a lot of things that we think of as gendered or maybe racial or sort of differences based on background, ethnicity, it's certainly not inherent. Like we're not going to say like, oh, women don't ask, like it's a feature. It's oftentimes what it is just not having information. And the people who have the information tend to be people who look a certain way or have a certain experience and have maybe a stronger sense of entitlement or the ability to ask for that information. And so, information is the way to level the playing field.
That's fantastic. Well, this was fun. Thank you both for agreeing to participate in my weird video. Hey, this has something to do with contracts, and we should talk about it on the blog. But I really had a lot of fun, and thank you both for joining us. Well, Jeremy, you had to be here.
Well, thanks for inviting me as your guest. I appreciate it. I always think it's great when mainstream contracts thinks about employment, its own little genre, kind of being in its own place. It's nice to put it up front because it's the contract that we are often in all days, all the time, every minute. It's a true universal.
Awesome. Jeremy, any final thoughts, or should we wrap it?
Well, I mean, if you want, you can let Veronica take us out with the Spanish one because she's really cruising in that one.
All right, that one's pretty short, so we'll throw that.
Oh. Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that one.
I still have like 20 minutes if you want.
Oh, okay.
All right, so I'm gonna share again. I've got to minimize and